you for tuning in to our premiere show today. We're excited that you could join us. And over the coming weeks, we have some really great shows planned for you and some really great guests, of course. And our show today is no exception. But before I introduce you to my guests, we're talking today about a phenomenon that is very strange and yet very real. And it's being experienced all over the world. We're talking about encounters with black-eyed children. And it all starts with a knock at the door. Take a look at this.
Can I help you?
Just ask me in.
Excuse me?
I want to go ahead and introduce my guests to you. We have David Weatherly here in our studio. We're excited to meet you today, David. David is actually a renowned author, researcher, and cryptozoologist. Welcome.
Thanks, Tracie.
And also Nick Redfern, who is also a renowned author, researcher, and cryptozoologist, and a very dear friend of mine for over 20 years. So welcome to the show, Nick.
Well, thanks, Tracie.
You're welcome. Nick, now you and I, we go back 20 years in our friendship. Can you believe it?
I can, actually.
It's been such a long time. And we started off researching the paranormal together. I never ever heard about these black-eyed kids back then, had you?
No, I hadn't, and that's an interesting angle because if you look at things like cryptozoology, the UFO subject, you know, we think we've covered everything and then something just pops up out of nowhere, and that's very much what happened with the black-eyed children phenomenon. Certainly back in the mid-1990s when we first met, nobody was talking about this phenomenon at all. And so that's one of the perplexing aspects of it, namely that it's literally surfaced out of nowhere. And I think it's really kind of gripped people's imaginations, the idea of these strange-looking kids turning up on people's doorsteps, knocking on the door late at night, and essentially creating this really creepy, weird vibe that they have, and everybody kind of senses this when they see the black-eyed children.
So is there a certain story that you had read, Nick, that made you go down this path of researching it?
Well, I guess I would have to say that from my perspective, it was very much David's work that got me interested. David is without doubt the acknowledged expert on the subject, and I wrote the foreword for David's book, and when he sent the manuscript to me, I was like, whoa, you know, this is like something out of a horror movie, except for one thing, it was definitively real. And I realised that David had tapped into something that really no one had ever really covered before. When a new aspect of the phenomenon develops, you know, it's good that there's an expert who we can go to and listen to and get the information, and that's certainly what David has done, and it's really opened up this phenomenon on a worldwide basis.
Right, and I'm going to come to you now, David, as our expert, because you have written this fabulous book, OMG. It is The Black-Eyed Kids, and I have to tell you, David, I could not put this book down when I started to read it. It's absolutely terrifying. In fact, I started to have dreams that black-eyed kids were coming into my house. So it really is a terrifying subject. What started this whole black-eyed kid path for you?
Well, actually in the mid-90s, I started hearing a few of these accounts in the early days of the internet. A few of them had cropped up, most significantly an account from a gentleman named Brian Bethel in Texas. And a lot of people kind of mark his encounter as the beginning of the modern wave of these sightings. What got me personally interested was after hearing the stories a few times and finding them intriguing, and of course they're very creepy, but at the same time they were sort of, well, this could be urban legend. Yet when I started to dig into it a little bit more and started meeting people who had experienced an encounter with these kids, that was pretty
eye-opening, because it's when you interview someone who has encountered these kids, it's like speaking to a trauma victim. So when I started to gather personal accounts from people, then I realized there's something much more here than just a simple urban legend.
Right. And Nick, you wrote the foreword to the book, as you said, and you create a really great atmospheric wording here in the foreword, where you get the reader acquainted with, admittedly, very creepy controversy that all these kids want to do is they just want to come in.
Yeah.
They just want to come in. And describe the kids to us, Nick, what they look like that just want to come in.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one of the most important aspects of the story, is that they don't just look like kids with black eyes, which is strange enough in itself. They're typically very pale looking, very smooth skin, obviously these penetrating black eyes. And when we talk about black eyes, we're talking about literally the entire eye being black. And very often wearing black hoodies as well, coming out late at night, knocking on the door, and trying to find every way they can to get into the house. We're lost. Can we come in and phone our parents? We're homeless. And it gets really creepy when you realise that you're right, that every intention on their part is to get into the person's home. Now, of course, the big question is, what is so important that they need to get into the home? It clearly isn't, that they need to phone their parents, or they're lost, or they're homeless, or they're hungry. There's a more sinister aspect to this.
Right.
And I think it's pretty telling that in a number of cases when people have opened the doors, as David will know, dogs, for example, have reacted in a very adverse fashion, as if they can pick up on something really sort of malevolent and menacing. And I think, that really gets to the heart of it. There's nothing positive about these experiences at all. There's something dangerous, something malevolent wants to get into the house.
Right. And David, there are many accounts that you write about in your book of these strange kids. A large percentage in the United States have been seen, but they're also documented in the UK, Australia, Canada, South Africa, and even Iraq. Iraq? Really?
Virtually everywhere at this point. I mean, since the book was published, of course, I get emails every day about encounters with these kids. And some of them are people who are realizing, oh my gosh, this is what I experienced 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I have indeed had some veterans of the Iraqi conflict who have come back and said that they encountered these black-eyed children while they were stationed in Iraq.
Wow, wow. Is there any more countries that you have now added to this list?
Some Asian encounters that have surfaced in the last few years in particular, and especially Japan and China already had some accounts that sort of bordered into the black-eyed kid territory. They have these legends of the hungry ghost, for instance. And in some instances, they would identify those entities as the black-eyed children or vice versa. But now that more people are aware of this particular phenomena, more people are identifying various types of accounts with the black-eyed children.
Right. Is there any place in the United States where these sightings are more centralized, would you say?
Initially when I started researching the book, there were clusters. The Midwest, Texas, the West Coast, those were probably the biggest clusters. But as time went on, I found that they show up everywhere.
Yeah.
Literally, from the largest city to the smallest rural town, there are accounts of these things.
Right. So these kids appear on doorsteps. They can appear at car windows, hotel rooms, coffee shops, gas stations, department stores, and even boats.
Boats.
The whole wide gamut. In your book, you mention a few possibilities of what you think these children are. Do you think they are demonic? Do you think they are alien hybrids, interdimensional? Or you've already said you don't think it's an urban legend. So what do you think here, David?
My personal opinion, after all the research I've done, is that these are some type of interdimensional beings. I really believe that they're coming through from some other level of existence and sort of intruding into our reality.
Right. And I personally, I think I agree with you on that. I don't think they are demons because I was thinking, you know, well, why would if it was a demon, why would they choose a form of a child? But it's actually a very simple answer because it's more appealing to someone opening the door that they're seeing a child standing in front of them that may be helpless, homeless, or whatever, rather than a 6-foot black-eyed guy.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that occurs in these encounters. You'll find that the witnesses, or the victims as I refer to them, actually go through sort of a psychological battle. You know, as adults, we're hardwired to help a child.
Yes.
If a child approaches you in a parking lot or comes to your door and says, hey mister, or hey ma'am, I need some help, your natural inclination is to offer assistance to that child. But these are people who are experiencing that scenario with the additional factor that all their personal alarm bells are going off. You know, the hair on the back of the neck, the tingling skin, it's various descriptions that people say, but they all consistently say, I wanted to help this kid, but everything was telling me that something was wrong here. And that nervousness quickly escalates into outright fear, and they end up running away from these children, especially after complete eye contact is made and they realize there's just nothing but a solid black orb, you know, in the place of the two eyes.
Nick, what's your opinion on what you think they are?
Well, I'm kind of inclined to go with the same approach as David. We're talking about something interdimensional, multidimensional, but you know, I am interested in the other theories as well. Although I don't personally subscribe to the alien-human hybrid, a case could be made in some respects because one of the most glaring issues is the black eye. Now, of course, in ufology, we have the so-called greys, the alien greys, which are typified by these large black eyes, and they're sort of typically pale and skinny looking. So you could make an argument that, you know, if you crossbred an alien grey and a human, you might have something that looked like a black-eyed child. However, I think it's important to note that for the most part, UFOs actually don't play a part pretty much at all in black-eyed children encounters. There's very much, I guess, like an assumption that it's somehow tied to the subject, when it actually isn't to any great degree. So I think we're dealing with something that possibly has the ability to jump in and out of our reality and only be sort of a temporarily present visitor.
Right. And David, you had said in your book that when you first heard stories about these BEKs, these black-eyed kids, you thought the phenomena could easily be explained, perhaps by someone with too much time on their hands and, you know, sitting behind a keyboard, but your opinion had changed when you began to hear personal accounts. And these were from normal and upstanding people in society, such as police officers, firemen, nurses, and who were not seeking publicity at all, that had encountered these strange children that had terrified them. So why is this phenomena spreading, do you think?
You know, I'm not sure I have an answer for that. It's very curious that the accounts are increasing dramatically. I account, part of that I attribute to the fact that people are becoming aware of the phenomena and they have a label to put on it, so to speak. You know, I referenced earlier people that contact me and say, oh my gosh, this is what I saw 10 years ago or more. There are a lot of accounts from people who have these experiences, but they don't know how to frame it. You know, I've literally had someone say to me, I didn't know if this was a ghost or an alien or even how to describe it to someone because it's so far out the box, you know, from other things that we're used to. And at the same time, what's intriguing about the phenomena for me, when I initially started researching it, I found so many similarities with different types of phenomena. You know, Nick and I had a lengthy discussion about the connections between these black-eyed kids and the men in black. And there are indeed a lot of similarities. It's very curious, but you could equally argue that they are something demonic or that they are an alien hybrid. And it just became so fascinating the more I dug into it that, you know, I really wrote the book in a way that would let everyone make their personal decision based on the information that's out there.
Right, right. And is it true that no black-eyed kid has ever been photographed?
That is correct.
Or captured?
That is correct. Now, what's interesting about that is that there have been occasions where these kids have been encountered and there have been things like security cameras present, and the security cameras malfunction.
Right, that's very,
So
very
very
strange.
MIB again.
It is, and you know, in the coming weeks we do have a show with Nick about Men in Black, so do stay tuned for that one. It's going to be a really fantastic show. I wanted to show this video footage, Nick, to you specifically because our hometown of Staffordshire has Cannock Chase, which is a wooded area, and you may have seen this video out there that's suggesting that this is a black-eyed kid wandering around this in this wooded area. So let's take a look. So that was the footage, Nick, from Cannock Chase. We had an email question for you, actually, from one of our joint friends in England, Gary Cartledge.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and he said, please ask the fallow Brit a question about this Cannock Chase footage. Nick, I'd be interested on your views to the relationship of Cannock Chase and UFO activity. Cannock is a UFO hotspot at times, and also the black-eyed children are seen there. So, black-eyed kids and UFOs at Cannock Chase?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting angle because, as you know personally, Cannock Chase, this large area of forest in central England, is a hotspot for numerous strange activity. There have been reports of UFO sightings, a UFO crash, reports of large black cats roaming around the area, Bigfoot-type creatures, even things that resemble werewolves. So, in other words, the entire place is sort of a magnet for paranormal phenomena. And one of the interesting theories is that there are certain parts of the world that act as portals, if you like, that open up our world to other realms. And if you have the ability, you can cross over from one realm to the other. And so, in other words, I don't think it's coincidental that the black-eyed children should also turn up when you have this entire menagerie of other things there as well. And I think this re-emphasizes the interdimensional angle. And so I guess from my perspective, having a long, deep knowledge of what goes on Cannock Chase, it doesn't surprise me that the black-eyed children should turn up there. And I think perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates their supernatural nature. You know, they could turn up anywhere at random, but they choose to turn up at a place which is already steeped in weird activity. And as far as how they tie in with that other phenomena, I think the connection is the portal angle. You know, if you can find a way to cross over from one realm of existence to another, then you would have exactly what we see at Cannock Chase.
Right. And David, from the witnesses that you've talked about in your book, there's something very wrong or unnatural about these kids, apart from their obvious strange appearance. They just can't put their finger on it, but the witnesses talk about feeling dizzy, and they feel like their heads are in a fog, and that all these the black eye the eye is totally black, which the witnesses say looks so evil, and that you're staring into this deep cavern that's very liquid looking and very shiny. And witnesses report that the children look unnatural, artificial, and that these are not cases of children with dark pupils. Both the pupil and the sclera, the white of the eye, are solid black. One witness in your book says that I don't think that anything human could have eyes like that. And you've heard the same thing, Nick.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that denotes the black-eyed children, is that the eye is totally inhuman. You know, we're used to dealing with people, with humans. This is inhuman. And there is no real rational way to explain this away as, you know, just a down-to-earth phenomenon. I think the more and more reports we get, and the more investigations that take place, we're certainly getting to see a bigger picture, which is an important aspect of the phenomenon. And I think with David's work particularly, what we're seeing is people coming forward saying, hey, you know, I saw something like this 10 years ago, 50 years ago. So it may actually not be a new phenomenon. That may be one of the things that we've been able to sort of, to a significant degree, we've been able to confirm that this isn't new, but it's newly reported. You know, and it's important to make the distinction between those two angles.
Right. And David, we talked about, Nick mentioned the fact that these kids have been seen with hoodies and jeans, trying to blend in like they're normal human children. But obviously it doesn't come off right to the witnesses.
And there's also a lot of occasions where people will describe the children in what they think is handmade clothing. Some people describe them as Amish or Mennonite. Old-fashioned is another term we hear a lot of times. So there doesn't seem to be a real consistency in those terms with a lot of the reports. It's almost as if a higher degree of intelligence, if you will, is sort of orchestrating all of these encounters. And it's just sort of testing different things to see exactly what works. I mean, we've talked about this aspect of utilizing the form of a child because it catches people unawares. And equally what happens in these encounters, you're talking about people having these weird side effects. And constantly I hear this, oh, I felt dizzy. One woman told me she felt like the children were trying to exert mind control or hypnosis on her. And she said that she felt herself going almost into a hypnotic trance. And when you look at the language that these children use, it too is very awkward. The phrases don't quite, they're just not right. They're not normal phrases that an average 10-year-old or 13-year-old kid is going to use. They'll say things like, is it food time? You should invite me in. I think it's food time. That's not,
that's not how a kid speaks.
That's not how a child speaks.
Right.
It's not how an adult speaks, for that matter.
Yeah.
So, you know, we hear this over and over again, and there is a certain level of awkwardness within these children, sort of across the board.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you the question about how their language sounds. You said in the book it sounds very formal and polite, but at the same time awkward, a strained monotone. And it's almost, one witness said it's almost as if they were taught a couple of lines that they memorized and just kept repeating the same thing over and over.
Exactly. And sometimes they'll say that the children are droning. I've heard that more than once, which I find a very curious phrase for what we're talking about in terms of these encounters. Similar to what we hear with Men in Black reports sometimes, that there's this droning sort of monotone in order to lull the person, it seems.
The Tracie Austin Show would like to thank our sponsor, Zohar Stargate TV. And for more information about our sponsor, please visit zoharstargate.com. So David, just to reiterate how these kids actually sound, one witness in your book said that the child seemed like he was programmed like a computer, telling you that you have mail. Is that correct?
The witnesses often say that the children only seem to know a few phrases, and they just repeat them over and over again in a very monotone, sort of droning speech. And that alone is unnerving for a lot of these people. You know, some witnesses have tried to engage the kids and ask, well, do you live around here? Where are your parents? And all these children will do is simply redirect to a question and a request to come inside.
Before we go into some of the cases in your book, David, which are really fantastic cases, Nick, just tell us about the case of the Texas journalist Brian Bethel and these black-eyed kids that he ran into. That was the earliest case in 1998, correct?
Well, certainly it was one of the earliest reported ones, and basically involved Brian Bethel actually out late at night depositing a cheque, and which he'd forgot to pay. And suddenly there was a knock on the window of the vehicle, and there were these two black-eyed children there. And we had the same sort of situation play out that we get when they knock on the front door, essentially looking for help, you know, we're hungry, we're homeless, that kind of thing. And like all of the witnesses, he developed this immediate feeling that there was something just not right. Just there was something totally wrong about these children. Couldn't necessarily put his finger on it properly until, of course, he saw the black eyes, and he essentially got the hell out of Dodge, so to speak. And
Right.
but when he looked back, the children were gone. They weren't in sight anywhere. And that's something which also comes into play with the Men in Black stories, another parallel. They're extremely good at vanishing and appearing in a mystifying fashion. And I think the case is one of many, obviously, but it's important because it really started to sort of put the stamp on the phenomenon. People began thinking, well, you know, what is this? Other people started to come forward. So although Brian Bethel's story isn't the first one, obviously, it is the one that really got the ball rolling, so to speak.
Right. And this, David, really resembles the cases in your book. Share with us the experience of these, this encounter with these kids from your friend Paul.
Paul was home one evening. He had just gotten home from work and was making himself a sandwich, having a drink, and he was home alone. And early evening, he heard a knock at the door. Now, this account is very typical of a lot of the encounters that I receive for a few key reasons. One is this, what some people refer to as this infernal knocking. These kids never use a doorbell. It's always a long, monotonous knock, and it just is continuous. Now, Paul heard the knock at the door and said that it just didn't stop. And at first he's thinking, why aren't they using the doorbell? And then he's thinking, why are they knocking like that? They won't stop. He went over, he opened the door, he finds a pair of kids on the door step, and they're sort of looking down at their shoes. This is also typical.
What do they always do?
Right.
Correct.
And, you know, they started with these strange comments, you know, hey, we just thought we'd come in for a while. And he says, you guys must have the wrong house. And the response is, we'll come in anyway. Just ask us in. So as the encounter unfolds, Paul goes from an uneasiness to outright nervousness to frankly stark fear when these kids look up and make eye contact with him. He realizes they have solid black eyes. All the alarm bells have went off, and he really kind of freaked out. He slammed the door. He rushed into the bedroom. He grabbed a firearm. Now, this is a gentleman who had a law enforcement background. He was sort of out of control, as he explained it to me. And he grabbed the sidearm and came rushing back, flung the door open. He was determined to confront these kids, and they had vanished. He raced outside to the lawn. He looked up and down the street. He ran up and down the sidewalk. There was no sign of these kids anywhere. And they weren't people from the neighborhood. That, you know, he'd never seen them in his life, and says he hasn't seen them since then. But the key points of this encounter are very typical for a lot of encounters across the board. You know, these kids show up, they create these three levels within the victim, you know, this unease, the nervousness, and then stark fear. And the flight response kicks in. Paul was a little bit unique in that he ran away enough so that he could respond somewhat. Most people just run and lock the door, and they're too terrified to even go back out or see if the kids are there.
Mm-hmm. And of course, being invited in, when these kids ask to be invited in, means to the predator, if we can call them a predator, that you know, they agree to whatever is going to come next once these kids are let in.
It does. And, you know, Tracy, you mentioned the whole demonic connection earlier. And what's intriguing is that, again, there could be an argument made that these kids are something demonic. Now, I'm not a proponent that that's what they are. However, the similarities are kind of stunning because we have something that clearly needs to be invited in. There are no cases of these kids just rushing into someone's house or climbing into their vehicle, you know, forcing themselves in.
Right.
They try to get that invitation. And that even goes back to classic vampire lore.
Yes.
But if we look at traditional demonology, the idea is that something demonic must somehow be invited, whether it's into the person's home, their life, whatever it is. And these kids seem to be trying to gain that invitation to take this to the next level, whatever that may be.
It's very cunning, isn't it?
It is indeed.
Of whatever this thing is, it's very cunning, and it plays very crafty, you know, representing a child to lead you to believe that.
There's a very sinister aspect to that. And, you know, you mentioned the word predator, which is interesting because I hear that very often from the victims. They say, I felt like I was being eyed by a predator. Now, who says that?
Yes.
If it's really a child, you know, why would you get that sense?
Right. Let's take a look at this clip, guys. Ale Marzulli is interviewing a witness who saw a black-eyed kid in the street. Ale Marzulli interviewed you, I believe.
He did.
David.
He's a great guy.
He's a great guy.
Yeah.
And I've interviewed Ale Marzulli on a previous show too. Very nice man. But let's take a look at this clip and see what we think.
I was about 2 blocks away from my house, you know, on my jog with my iPod.
And this is like morning or afternoon?
It was afternoon. It was
Okay.
it was actually, I can tell you exactly what time it
Okay.
was. It was exactly 5:17. And that is important because I had been having a reoccurring experience with that number.
My personal opinion, after researching it for so long, is that these children are some kind of interdimensional being, for lack of a better word.
But I had never seen any children ever on that corner, and I was 2 blocks away, and I was approaching the corner of Hartford and Shepherd, and there was a boy. He was about 10 years old, kind of striped shirt and baggy black pants, and it kind of looked a little strange. And the other thing that I noted was that he was wearing a yarmulke, which was very typical for that neighborhood.
What was
he
his
was to the
position?
side,
Okay.
and his head was down.
His head was down. Was he wearing
Yeah.
any yarmulke on? Right,
And he was
okay.
wearing a yarmulke,
Right.
yes. So I didn't think anything of it. You know,
Okay.
I'm running, I'm in my zone, I'm going east. And at the last minute as I approached him, I was just a few feet away. You know, I glanced up, and I usually smile hello at people. And that's what I did. I glanced up, and he caught me with this very intense look, and it was just frightening.
Whether they're there all the time and we're just not aware, or whether they're able to sort of shift into our reality, maybe that's the case. But the accounts are becoming more widespread. There are more and more of these stories showing up, and there's some kind of an agenda going on.
And this was like just the blackest depths that
Without putting words in your mouth,
I mean-
give me a word for what you saw.
it was just like a cavern of, like looking down into a vacant cavern with just like evil at the bottom.
Okay, so it's the operative word here would be evil.
Yes, for
Okay.
sure. Definitely.
So I believe that these beings, I don't think they have any good purpose at all. It's something very sinister. And I believe that they are actually somehow feeding off of that fear.
You're not sure, you know, you bolted the scene, and you're not sure how he left the scene because obviously, I mean, did you do this
didn't-
at least once?
No,
Look behind you? You just went-
I was so scared, honestly, because he was so evil, and I could
Have you
feel
ever
it.
felt
I could
fear?
feel it.
Have you ever felt fear like this before?
Well, not really to that extent.
Not to that
no,
extent.
I mean, all my hairs were standing up. You know, that's typically what happens when I encounter negative energy. I do get the hair standing on end thing going on, but I really just was so frightened by the whole thing that my only reaction was to run fast in the other direction and not look back. and I didn't look back. Otherwise, I may have seen him vanishing or something. I don't know.
I'm going to show you something. This is from a book by a person we're about to interview named David Weverly. And I want you to look at this cover. Did it look something like this?
Yes.
And that was the clip from Ali Marzulli's show, interviewing a witness there who'd seen one of these very strange black-eyed kids. David, are these encounters random? Or, you know, how do these kids choose their victims, if I can call them victims?
You know, Tracie, as an investigator, one of the things I always look for when I start researching things are patterns. Things that sort of connect the dots. And something that was very puzzling about the black-eyed kid encounters was that there were very, very few patterns. You know, there were no similarities in age range or ethnic background or religious belief of the people who were having these encounters. It got a little confounding, to tell you the truth. And I remember, you know, Nick and I had a whole long conversation about this possible UFO connection, because quite honestly, when I started researching this, I expected, okay, I bet there's going to be a lot of clusters of UFO sightings around these accounts. There were not.
Nothing.
The one interesting commonality I found among a lot of the people who had these encounters, a lot of authority figures, military personnel, law enforcement, firefighters, legal judges and things like that. And honestly, I'm still not quite sure what to make of that. You know, these are all, we're talking about high stress jobs, you know, people who are basically trying to do a service, you know, law enforcement, military, that type of people. Mm-hmm. But why they are chosen, I can't be sure.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, that was my next question. Why do you think they're choosing these type of people? But
and I get asked that all the time by the victims. They say, I don't, you know, why me? Why was I chosen? I'll tell you the other common thread. A large percentage of these people were raised religious but fell off their spiritual path. And these encounters, greater portion of the time, cause these people to go back to their traditional spiritual beliefs.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Lynn Marzulli has mentioned previously on other shows that these kids are possibly the result of hybrid breeding, and refers to the scriptures in Genesis 6 and how they relate to the fallen ones. What are your thoughts on that, Nick?
Well, you know, it's an interesting theory, but when we're dealing with sort of ancient manuscripts that have been deciphered and sort of decoded and translated, you know, multiple times, I think we need to be very careful. I think there's very often a tendency on our part to sort of put an implication or a scenario based on an ancient text and relate it to something that's going on in our world today. And that doesn't mean there isn't a connection, but I think we need to be very careful when we're sort of deciphering and analysing ancient texts and trying to, I guess, pinpoint things that are going on today that might be relevant. But in saying that, you know, a lot of people have made the connection with things like the Nephilim and the idea of sort of hybrids in ancient times. And are we seeing sort of a modern day equivalent of it today? I think, you know, these are the sort of questions that are certainly on the minds of pretty much everybody who looks into the black-eyed children phenomenon, because the phenomenon itself, by default almost, ensures that we're going to go down various pathways: the demonic, the extraterrestrial, the multidimensional, the vampire parallels. It's sort of so compelling and yet so weird that you know, we're struggling for answers, because it could go in multiple ways, and certainly the sort of the ancient astronaut Nephilim angle is one of them.
Mm-hmm. And David, let's talk about a really great chapter you write in your book about the jinn. D-J-I-N-N. These are, you say in your book, supernatural beings whose origins lie in the Middle East, better known to the Western world as genies, and are mentioned numerous times in the Muslim holy book, the Quran. The jinn are master shapeshifters and exist in a world parallel to ours. Like humans, they can be either good or evil, benevolent or malevolent. So as a master shapeshifter, it would be no problem for the jinn to take the guise of a black-eyed child then.
That's correct. The jinn are one of the more intriguing connections, I think. And, you know, in the Western world, we've sort of made fun of the genie, you know, as we call them over here, because if you're in my age bracket, you probably think of Barbara Eden, you know,
Yes.
doing all the silly magic, and you know, and then the younger generations, of course, had the Disney version of the big blue genie, you know, and this is all sort of comical to us in the Western world for the most part, but really this is a very serious matter when you go to the Middle East or Asia or other regions of the world, because these things are seen as being tangible entities that were created right along with humans and angels. And one of the things I emphasize to people about the jinn is that if you practice Islam, you believe in the existence of the jinn, period. Because one of the tenets of their belief is that anything that's written in the Quran is to be believed and taken as truth. So at the bare minimum, we have several billion Muslims in the world today. So, you know, that many people are holding in their consciousness the reality of the jinn. And when we start looking at a lot of jinn cases, there are indeed many, many similarities. And as you stated, the jinn can take any form. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that they do, they're very mischievous and they're outright sinister a lot of the times. And one of the things they try to do is to lure people in. And mm-hmm. what better way to do that than in the shape of a child? Exactly.
And Nick, it's even been suggested that these children could be the lost souls of murdered children. What do you think?
Well, that's one of the really controversial angles, and you know, you have to tread very carefully because of, you know, if you're talking about somebody's murdered children, you know, the parents are still alive, the last thing you want to do is create any more grief. You know, their child's already dead. The last thing you want to do is make it even worse for them. So I've heard that theory, but I think, you know, if we go down that path, you've got to be very responsible and careful and respectful of the parents. You know, mm-hmm. this isn't the sort of stuff to put in a magazine article. Mm-hmm. You know, it's something to research quietly and carefully. And if you feel you've made a case, say so, but don't sensationalize it when you've got grieving parents, you know.
Right, right. And David, you relay in your book of a case in China of an angry spirit terrorizing a nearby village because of a wrongful death. This 14 to 16-year-old child was seen knocking on doors and asking to be let in. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, when you go to Asia, there's a pretty solid tradition of different types of ghosts, and some of those are called vengeful spirits. People who have been wrongly accused, or people who were murdered, you know, various tragic stories that cause the spirit of that person to be stuck in this in-between world. Now, you have to bear in mind, we're not looking at a Christian perspective like most of the Western world. When we go to the East, we're looking at Buddhist and Taoist viewpoints, and their concept is that there is a realm in between, so to speak, where spirits can be trapped. Mm-hmm. And they refer to these entities as hungry ghosts. And those hungry ghosts will attempt to rectify the mistakes that they made or the wrongs that were done to them in their physical lives. So we get these cases where these spirits show up, and it's very curious because when I went to Asia and started talking to people about these black-eyed children, what I heard every time was, oh, that's a hungry ghost. Because a spirit stuck in that state will be deformed in some way. And the eyes, of course, are one of the things that can be deformed. In this case, we have what appears to be a normal person, but yet the eyes are solid black.
Mm-hmm. And similar stories in Japan.
Yes,
too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And according to many religions, there's traditions there that believe that an evil spirit cannot enter a household without receiving some kind of an invitation.
Exactly.
Is that true? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for some time it seemed that stories of black-eyed children were confined to the United States, but in recent years international accounts have surfaced, David, and you write about an amazing account of a guy in the UK, in London, in fact, who worked for the government, who encountered some of these kids. Tell us that
Bizarre
story.
encounter.
Yeah.
Bizarre encounter. He lived in he had an upstairs flat. The building was had a security code on the front door, so he had come home, he was in his flat, and he heard a knock at the door. When he answered it, here are these two kids, and he was very puzzled because there were no children in his building. He couldn't figure out how these kids had gotten in. As his encounter unfolds, he has very strange experiences mentally because he's thinking there's something wrong with these kids, but they're insisting they want to come in. He realizes at one point that unconsciously he has opened his door as if he's going to let them in. But then he sort of gets control of himself and he's trying to shake this off and he's thinking, no, something's not right. Here's one of the weird things, Tracie. He looks away for a moment, and when he looks back, there are now 3 kids.
Wow.
They've multiplied.
Wow. Wow.
Really, really bizarre. I've heard this a couple of other times, but this gentleman, he finally got control of himself. He slammed the door, and he heard this weird popping sound
Yes.
in the hallway. And when he opened the door back up, these kids had vanished. He equated that as them sort of coming and going because he had heard the sound at the beginning of the encounter too. Mm-hmm. And he equated that, again, like a lot of people, he got intrigued about this phenomenon, started digging into different things, and came across the idea of portals, and thought, well, these kids came through something dimensional, and this was the sound that the doorway made when it opened up and they came in.
Right. There was also a kind of weird sound, he said, like a thud, that it seemed these had come from the ceiling.
As if they had fallen down into the space or something.
Into the space.
Like a whoomp sound. And the other weird thing was this was kind of funny when he was telling me, he said that the kids seemed like they were putting on a bad British accent.
I was going to ask you about that. Yes, of what the dialect was, the
Right.
language.
Right. And I believe they said something to him like, hey mate, we want to watch telly. And
Wow.
it's like, you kids don't sound British.
No. That is
But
funny.
it added to the creepiness of the encounter,
Right.
obviously, for him. And
Right.
yeah, he was a government employee. And nothing quite added up about the situation. But again, this was another person who experienced a lot of after effects after that encounter. Some of these aren't in the book because in fact, I heard from him recently, and he told me that he is still experiencing strange dreams.
Really?
Where these kids, where he sees them walking around in the streets or coming in his building.
It's a very fascinating subject. Like I said, I read your book. I couldn't put the book down, and it was terrifying. Some of these accounts that I was reading about. We talked a little bit about how animals are being affected, and you mentioned in your book, David, even a pit bull was scared of one of these kids that came to the door. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that was a fellow in Texas who came home. He had some grocery bags. Now, his account was that he walked up to the front of his house, and his yard is completely bare. I mean, no trees or anything. So he has a simple flight of steps that go up to his front door. As he's at the door, opening putting the key in and opening the door, all of a sudden he realizes there's a kid standing on the ground by the steps. And he was very startled, obviously, because it was as if this child just appeared suddenly. He turns and looks at this boy, who looks at him and says, "Is it food time?" What do you say to that? Mm-hmm. This guy didn't know what to say. He just sort of, he was completely stunned. He sort of paused and said, he was struggling to say something. And the boy repeats, "I think it's food time. You should invite me in." Now, the fellow did have bags from the grocery store. He had been grocery shopping. As this encounter is unfolding, his front door has swung open. Within his front door is a long hallway that leads back to his living room. Mm-hmm. Solid wood floors. He hears his dog at the back of the house barking, and he can tell that it's coming closer. He sort of steals a glance into the door and sees this dog charging full bore down the hall for the front door. But it gets creepy because when the dog almost reaches the front door, it tries to put the brakes on. We're talking about a Scooby-Doo scene. This dog is trying to backpedal,
Right.
but on the slick floor can't do it, and the dog literally tumbled over itself out onto the step,
Oh my gosh.
jumped up as quick as it could with its tail between its legs, ran back into the house. Now, this guy was stunned because this is a trained attack dog. He himself ducks into the house, slams the door, goes around to another room and looks through the blinds to see if this kid is still out there, and the kid's gone. But Tracie, this dog was hiding under the master bed
Wow.
and was terrified. The dog has not been the same since then. He had to drag the dog out from under the bed just to try to get it to go to the bathroom and to eat,
Wow.
and it just kept going back under the bed and hiding.
My
He has
gosh.
no explanation for that. And as Nick referenced earlier, you know, it's very curious when we see these encounters with animals present because they have a different level of sensitivity,
right.
and they pick up on things that we don't as humans.
That's right. So I think, our audience are wanting to know this $1 million question. Has anyone ever let them in?
You know,
Dun,
the
dun,
creepy
dun.
question that kind of lingers is how many people have let them in that we don't know about. That was one of the, when the book first came out, Whitley Strieber, in fact, called me, and that was one of the first things he said to me. This unnerves me. How many people did this, let them in, and we don't know. There is one account that's in the book. If you want to hear about that, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So Tracie, there is one account that's in the book that was a really stunning case. And the scenario was this: a woman was driving home. She had her 10-year-old son in the back of the vehicle with her. She lived in a small rural area. Everyone knows everyone. She stopped by the local convenience store. She jumped out of the vehicle, left her 10-year-old son in the car. She ran inside, grabbed some, milk, bread, or whatever. And we've all done this. She comes back out on autopilot. She jumps in, she's turning the key as she glances up in the rearview mirror. Staring back at her in the rearview mirror, kid with solid black eyes.
Oh my gosh.
This child was in the back seat directly beside her son, which that in itself is kind of creepy.
Yes, it is.
Instead of being on the other
very
side,
creepy.
is right directly beside her son. She was instantly terrified. She jumped out of the vehicle. She opened the back door. She snatched her son out. She ran back in the convenience store. When she got inside, she's sort of stuttering and stammering, and the clerk realizes something's wrong. He's saying, "What's happening? Do I need to call the police?" All she can get out is that there's someone in her vehicle. The clerk runs outside. Here's her vehicle, doors open, engine running, no sign of anyone. He searches the lot, nothing. This is a convenience store / gas station, wide open lot, no sign of anyone. So again, here's this child that has vanished. Now the story gets more disturbing because she could not bring herself to get back in the vehicle. She couldn't tell the clerk what had happened. She was too shaken up by it. She called her husband. She couldn't tell him on the phone. All she could say was, "Get up here right now." Husband arrives. She says, I can't take my vehicle. We need to switch vehicles. They do so. She drives his vehicle home. He gets partway home and gets in an accident. The last thing he remembers is a foul odor sort of overtaking him, and he blacks out, totals the vehicle, ends up in the hospital. They keep him for observation. They think he has a concussion. He can't explain what's wrong. Meanwhile, the wife is talking to her son saying, "Do you know that boy?" And the boy says, "No, Mommy, I don't know him." And she said, "Well, why was he sitting back there with you?" "Well, I asked him to get in, Mommy. I thought we could go to my house and play." So this child actually issued an invitation at the behest of this black-eyed child. Mm-hmm. The result was not just the accident that the husband had and the totaling of that vehicle, but the couple's 10-year-old son became very ill. They took the child to the doctor. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with this boy. At first they said, "Oh, he's got a flu. It's just a virus." Then the symptoms changed. They said, well, wait a minute, his appendix might be ruptured. We might have to operate. Then they said, no, wait a minute, he's breaking out in a rash. We think it's the measles. Every time they thought they had a diagnosis, the symptoms would change.
Wow.
The result was they had no idea what to do with this poor kid. You know, they're just watching him as the symptoms change. And the family finally says, look, it probably is just a virus, we'll take him home. Because the mother at this point knew that there was something more sinister at play. So the result was the family took the child home. They too reverted back to their traditional religious beliefs. They called some old friends. They started a prayer circle and a vigil around this child. And he was sick for quite some time, but eventually the family believes through prayer this child recovered.
Wow, that's an amazing story. It seems then that these kids are omens of disaster.
In a lot of cases, that does seem to be indicated.
Right.
It also seems that the more contact there is, the closer proximity these children are to the victim, the more dire the consequences. And funny, you know, Nick and I were just talking about the whole omen aspect and the Mothman and Point Pleasant connection earlier.
Yes, and you've heard similar stories, omens of disaster. With these
Oh
kids.
yeah, I mean, you can look at the black-eyed children as being an omen, or they're orchestrating it deliberately.
Chicken or the egg.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
But there are a lot of cases in the paranormal field where people have fallen sick and dangerously ill in the proximity of strange creatures. I've got a number of reports where people have been in the close proximity to the men in black and the women in black phenomenon, and they've fallen ill within days with obscure illnesses and diseases and things like that. It's almost like as if they've been supernaturally infected somehow.
And then there's the bad luck aspect, because
Yeah.
there are a lot of these people who have, there was a woman who reached out and touched one of these kids and
Yes.
reported that the child's skin was as cold as death and felt unnatural. But the result was that this woman had a whole series of misfortunes. You know, her relationship suddenly ended, she lost her job, just a whole series of bizarre things.
And even death.
Yes.
In some cases.
Death in
as
the
well.
family, yes.
Yeah.
One of the weirder aspects, talking about, you know, this bad luck and things like that, is, as David will tell you, that when people who've read his book started to experience weird things in the home.
That's not going to help sales.
Well, actually, it actually might help sales.
It might help sales.
But you know, the idea they're reading the book late one night, and like, electrical equipment starts to play up. Again, as if there's some reading about the black-eyed children somehow invokes them, if you like, just the mere fact of thinking about them.
It's like the power of suggestion.
In many respects, but it may not be just all in the mind. It's almost as if you're unconsciously calling them through.
And some of the things are really strange. You know, when the book first came out, I had a woman who contacted me, and she said that she opened the book one night, and just when she started to read it, and she heard this weird beeping sound in her home. She didn't know what it was. She finally identified that it was the timer on her oven. That she said she'd lived there for years and never used the timer on her oven. So all of a sudden it's going off. And she just sort of put that down as, okay, well, that's weird. But then, you know, the next night it was something else. And then another night she starts to read it again, and the garage door opened itself. And she said, okay, that's enough. And she sent me an email. She said, look, I'm really interested in this phenomena, but if studying it is going to invoke their presence, I don't want anything to do with it. But curiously enough, as Nick will tell you, you know, later on, this woman contacted me, it must have been a year later, and said that she had repressed memories of encountering these kids.
Really? It's a very fascinating subject. And what's interesting as well, David and Nick, these kids don't seem to be like normal human kids that carry cell phones or iPods. They've never
been spotted with any modern electronics. The other curious thing is no one has ever seen a blemish on these kids. No freckle, no pimple, you know, no nothing. And we're talking about kids that most of the time are reported in the range of 10 to 15 years old.
Yes. And Nick, there are encounters with adults that have black eyes as well.
Yeah, there are actually a mutual friend of ours, Christina George. She had an experience in California in 2012. She's a paranormal investigator, and after completing one particularly intriguing and weird series of events, she got home to find this woman and 2 children on her front yard. You know, what are they doing here? It was a cul-de-sac, and she was with her friend of, she was with a friend of hers at the time. And what happened was they pulled up at the house, and this woman and these 2 children were just stood there. Very, very strange situation. They looked strange. Christina described how one of them had extremely pale skin, and they went inside the house and they were still outside on the front yard, just staring and looking inside the house. Christina grabbed a pair of binoculars and looked outside, and it was almost with unison that the woman and the 2 children turned round and looked directly at her as she was looking out the window through the binoculars. And she said as she looked at them, not just the children, but the woman herself had got just solid black eyes. And this is, I won't say that, you know, they're unheard of. There are a number of black-eyed adults. But in this case, we had 1 black-eyed adult and 2 black-eyed children. I think that's important because it demonstrates another level, another aspect of this mystery.
So I have a personal friend who had encountered a black-eyed adult, actually in Michigan. They used to live there. And she took her kids to Target one day. It was around about Christmas time. And they went through Target, they're choosing out some gifts and things like that. They go to the cash register to pay for them. And she said that she was there at the cash register. There was someone else, another person standing by the side, and then this guy that she could see when he turned to her had black eyes. He handed her son a Spider-Man clock. And of course, Spider-Man with black eyes, which I thought was a little odd. But she said it's as if when he reached over to give her son the Spider-Man clock, it's almost as if he went through the person in front, through their body, and handed this clock. So I thought that was a really bizarre encounter of this guy that looked pretty normal, apart from solid black eyes, that handed this Spider-Man clock.
Yeah, it's
it's a very strange story. And then another friend of mine just recently heard about the show that we were doing tonight, said she encountered a black-eyed adult with her kids back in April here in Las Vegas. So let's have a look at some of the medical factors that you write about in your book, David, because you've done a lot of research on this, and I think it's brilliant. You've researched a condition called mydriasis. No reported cases of turning a person's eye completely black, an excessive dilation of the pupil caused by the disease of trauma. So it does not cause whites of the eye to vanish.
That's correct.
That is correct. Glaucoma condition. New medicine in recent years has found to change the eye color and only found in 15% of patients taking the medication. People with blue eyes, hazel eyes, and green eyes have all turned brown after a year of using this medication. And again, this effect is on the pupil of the eye, and there are no documented cases that shown the eyes turn black.
That's correct also.
Aniridia, a Greek term which translates without an iris.
That's correct.
A very rare condition, usually congenital. Vision is severely limited. A hereditary disease associated with Gillespie syndrome. A number of patients are found to suffer from mental retardation and the Wager syndrome. So treatment includes the prescription of a black contact lens. Considered an extremely rare condition, and those suffering from it are usually undergoing treatment for other conditions associated with it.
That's correct. And all of these conditions, Tracy, you know, we're talking about extreme sensitivity to the eyes, and physicians will tell these patients, look, you need to not be out in direct sunlight, you need to not be out with too much exposure. They'll often prescribe very dark sunglasses for them to wear and things like that. So, we're not looking at a situation where we're not looking at a situation where people with these rare eye conditions are running around knocking on doors trying to get entry.
Right.
It's just not the case.
Right.
But I did have to pursue the medical aspect because, there's a lot of questions that sort of hang in the air there. And, you have to go down every path to see if there are some explanations possible.
Absolutely. You did a great job of it. The use of cocaine can cause the pupils to dilate. The eyes become watery and wide in appearance, but again, does not turn the eye black. Marijuana gives the eyes a sleepy appearance, has difficulty keeping the eyes open, and sensitivity to bright lights, as you said, although drug use usually causes the eyes to take on a bloodshot appearance. No drugs are reputed to turn the eye, including the sclera, black. Drug users have other side effects: nervousness, paranoia, extreme reactions ranging from anger to laughter, and slurred speech. Black-eyed kids do not exhibit any of these symptoms.
That's correct.
Also, these kids aren't wearing black contact lenses, are they?
No, I don't believe that they are. When I first did the initial research on the book, there were black contact lenses available at that time, the full sclera lens. Now, back when I did the research, those contact lenses were about $300 a pair.
Wow, that's expensive.
So, this is not something that 10-year-old kids were out purchasing just for a kick. And they were very, very difficult to get at the time. They were strictly from theatrical supply companies. Now, those lenses are very common. They are very easy to get. They're very inexpensive at this point. I've talked to people who've worn the full sclera lenses, and they say that most users report they're fairly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
If you've ever worn contacts, you know that they take a little bit of getting used to. If you can imagine one that covers the entire eye, that takes some real getting used to. And interesting enough, a lot of people told me that it limits peripheral vision when they wear those things.
Well, and I was just going to say that there has to be some restriction there.
That's correct.
Yeah, absolutely. We had an email question to you, David, from Joseph in Toronto in Canada. And he asks, David, do you think that these kids see color like a person who has a regular human eye?
Wow, that's a difficult question to answer, obviously, because we don't know exactly what they are. I will say that, physicians told me that if there was a medical condition wherein the person's eye was completely black, then they would essentially be blind because of the way, color and light receptors work in our eyes. We have to have that variation there. So, I don't think these are actually human children, so it's really hard to say exactly what they are perceiving.
Absolutely. David, do you have any events coming up that our audience could follow you?
Oh gosh, I have lots of things coming up. I will be at Octagon Hall the weekend of Halloween on the 28th, I believe. That is a notorious haunted site in Kentucky. We'll be doing a very special event there. I'm coming to Australia. I'll be in Australia for a week for 2 events at the end of November. Oh gosh, I have so many things to say. You kind of put me on the spot with that one. So, but people are welcome to check my blog, and I always update events and so forth that I.
And you have a website?
I do. It is at twocrowsparanormal.blogspot.com. That is TWOCROWS paranormal.blogspot.com.
Perfect. And Nick, any events coming up for you?
Yeah, I've got 2 in October. I've got the New England UFO Conference at the start of the month, and then in the second week I've got the Texas Bigfoot Conference. A lot of people don't realise that particularly East Texas, which is heavily forested, we get a lot of Bigfoot reports from there, so that's always a good conference.
Interesting. And your website, Nick?
Yeah, it's called World of Whatever, and people can reach me at nickredfern40an, F-O-R-T-E-A-N, .blogspot.com. That's my website.
Right. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, David, for joining us today. This has been a real interesting conversation. I'm going to be thinking about black-eyed kids for a very long time. And if at the end of a long day, you're home and you hear a slow, gentle knock at the door, it may be safer to simply not answer. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye. The Tracie Austin Show would like to thank our sponsor, Zohar Stargate TV. And for more information about our sponsor, please visit zoharstargate.com.